How did your relationship with your dad develop then?
My personal life to become a happier, more positive person.
Finally grew up, I guess, to a certain degree. Just a connection with me. I think he actually wanted to touch base with a lot of family that he left behind.
Julian Lennon's childhood was immortalized in songs like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, a brief reconnection in the mid-1970s, a sudden and violent ending on December 8, 1980, and a long legal and emotional aftermath that stretches into the 1990s and beyond. His life has been far from ordinary. There were dates, decisions, absences, and returns. Naturally, many claim that Julian Lennon despises Yoko Ono, the woman who, according to him, disrupted everything: his parents' marriage and his childhood. So, what was actually happening in the tumultuous Lennon household? Born into fame, raised in absence. The story began on April 8, 1963, in Liverpool, England, where Julian Lennon was born into a world already trembling under the rising force of the Beatles. His father, John Lennon, was not yet the global icon he would become, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Within months, Beatlemania began to ignite across the United Kingdom, and by 1964, it exploded internationally, with over 73 million viewers watching the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show in the United States. Julian's arrival coincided with the precise moment when his father evolved from a young musician into a cultural phenomenon almost overnight. Yet inside that storm, another reality unfolded quietly. John's marriage to Cynthia Lennon was deliberately kept out of the spotlight. When they married in August 1962, it was done quickly and with minimal publicity after Cynthia became pregnant. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, strongly encouraged secrecy, fearing that fans, particularly teenage girls, would react negatively to the image of a married pop star. As a result, while millions screamed John's name, very few even knew he had a wife and child. Cynthia later described living in near isolation. She had to move between apartments. She rarely appeared in public with John. It was as if she had been effectively erased from the story. And the world bought this narrative. By the time Julian was a toddler, the gap between public image and private life had widened into something almost unrecognizable. In 1964 and 1965, the Beatles were touring relentlessly, North America, Europe, and Australia, spending months away from home. John's physical absence became routine. Julian's early memories were shaped less by a father's presence and more by photographs, records, and the distant echo of a voice that belonged more to stadiums than to a home. Then, in 1966, John met Yoko Ono at an art exhibition in London. At first, the interaction appeared minor, but by 1967, their connection deepened, coinciding with a period of intense personal change in John's life, including experimentation with controlled substances and a growing detachment from his existing relationships. Cynthia later recounted that John's personality shifted during this time. He became more introspective, more distant, and increasingly absorbed in a world she did not share. For Julian, still only 3 or 4 years old, these shifts were invisible in detail, but profound in consequence. The rupture arrived in 1968. Cynthia returned from a trip to find Yoko Ono in her home. Within months, the marriage collapsed. The divorce was finalized in November 1968, when Julian was just 5 years old. The settlement included 100,000 euros, a substantial sum at the time, equivalent to over 1.5 million euros today when adjusted for inflation. Custody of Julian granted to Cynthia, and structured financial support. But the legal closure did nothing to stabilize the emotional fallout. From that point forward, Julian's upbringing shifted entirely into his mother's world. He moved with Cynthia, eventually living in Wales after her remarriage, away from the epicenter of London's music scene. Meanwhile, John's life accelerated in a different direction: public activism, avant-garde art, and a new family with Yoko Ono, culminating in the birth of his second son, Sean, in 1975. The contrast was stark. One child raised largely outside the spotlight, the other growing up within John's immediate orbit during his later years. Contact between Julian and his father became sporadic. There were visits, phone calls, occasional gestures, but no consistent presence. Even as John wrote songs that spoke of love, peace, and connection, the practical reality of fatherhood remained fragmented. But you see, Julian was not entirely outside his father's world. Childhood echoed in legendary music. In early 1967, inside a quiet classroom in Weybridge, Surrey, a 4-year-old Julian Lennon carried home a watercolor drawing. It showed a girl floating among stars, his classmate Lucy O'Donnell. When he showed it to his father, John Lennon, he described it in simple terms: Lucy in the sky with diamonds. That phrase, lifted directly from a child's imagination, became the title of one of the most recognizable songs in modern music. By June 1, 1967, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was released on the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a record that sold over 32 million copies worldwide and won 4 Grammy Awards. The song quickly became entangled in controversy, with widespread speculation that its initials referenced a certain psychedelic substance. John Lennon repeatedly denied this, insisting the origin was Julian's drawing, a claim later supported by Paul McCartney and even Lucy O'Donnell herself decades later. What began as a child's painting quietly transformed into a global cultural artifact, heard by millions who never knew the boy behind it. Just weeks later, another thread began forming, this time on a road stretching from London to Weybridge in 1968. Paul McCartney drove out to visit Julian and his mother, Cynthia Lennon, after learning about the collapse of their marriage. During that journey, McCartney started composing a melody meant to soothe the 5-year-old caught in emotional upheaval. The working title was Hey Jules, a direct reference to Julian, but it later became Hey Jude, released in August 1968. At 7 minutes and 11 seconds, it became the Beatles' longest single, topping the Billboard Hot 100 for 9 consecutive weeks in the United States and selling over 8 million copies. The song's famous refrain, "Take a sad song and make it better," was not abstract poetry. It was a direct attempt to comfort a child navigating divorce, even as the song itself became an anthem sung in stadiums across the world. Yet beneath these monumental creations lay a quieter, less visible truth. Julian's real experience did not mirror the emotional resolution promised in the music. While Hey Jude offered reassurance and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds captured innocence, his daily life remained shaped by separation. After the divorce was finalized in November 1968, Julian lived primarily with his mother, away from the recording studios of Abbey Road and the inner circle of the Beatles. The songs traveled globally, but the circumstances that inspired them did not resolve in the same way. This separation became even more apparent in the relationships Julian formed during those years. While his contact with his father was intermittent, his connection with McCartney took on a different tone. Photographs from the late 1960s showed McCartney playing with Julian, laughing, engaging in the kind of casual interaction that one would expect from a father. Julian himself later noted that he spent more relaxed time with McCartney than with his own father during certain periods. At the same time, the scale of what surrounded him continued to expand. In 1967 alone, the Beatles dominated global charts, with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band holding the #1 position in the UK for 27 weeks. By 1968, they were recording The White Album, a double LP that sold over 24 million copies worldwide. These numbers were staggering, almost abstract, yet they formed the backdrop of Julian's childhood. His personal milestones unfolded against a constant surge of global attention directed toward the music that, in part, originated from his own life. There was also a strange permanence to it all. Long after the events themselves had passed, the songs remained fixed in time. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds continued to be played, streamed, and reinterpreted decades later, while Hey Jude became one of the most covered songs in history, performed by artists across generations. Each replay reactivated a moment from Julian's early years, preserving it in a form that was both public and unchanging. Meanwhile, his own memories evolved, a father-son relationship marked by distance. By the late 1960s, the distance between Julian Lennon and his father, John Lennon, was no longer subtle. John's schedule through 1969 alone included recording sessions for Give Peace a Chance, the Bed-Ins for Peace in Amsterdam and Montreal, and constant media appearances. In that same year, Julian turned 6. The timelines barely intersected. What made this distance sharper was that John Lennon himself later acknowledged the flaws that contributed to it. In a 1980 interview with Playboy magazine, conducted just months before his death, he openly admitted to being violent in earlier relationships, stating he had been a hitter and cruel. By that point, he was attempting to redefine himself, speaking about personal growth and emotional awareness. But the timing mattered. These admissions came more than a decade after the critical years of Julian's childhood, when the damage, through absence, instability, and inconsistency, had already taken shape. For Julian, the experience was less about isolated incidents and more about a pattern. In multiple interviews given in the 1990s and 2000s, he described his father as largely absent during his upbringing. Between 1968 and the mid-1970s, contact was sporadic. Meanwhile, John's public life intensified. Albums like Imagine and Mind Games reinforced his global image as a voice of peace and introspection, while his activism against the Vietnam War placed him under surveillance by the U.S. government, culminating in a deportation attempt initiated in 1972. The contrast was stark, a man speaking to millions about love and unity, while his connection to his first son remained fragmented. Julian did not remain silent about this contradiction. In later interviews, including one with The Daily Telegraph, he spoke candidly about what he saw as a disconnect between John's public message and private behavior. He described his father as someone who could talk about peace and love out loud to the world, but struggled to show it consistently within his own family. Yet the story was not defined solely by absence. There were brief, almost cinematic moments where the distance narrowed. The most notable occurred between 1973 and 1975, during John's separation from Yoko Ono, a period often referred to as the Lost Weekend. While living in Los Angeles with May Pang, John reconnected with Julian. They spent time together, including visits to Disneyland, and shared musical experiences. During this period, John bought Julian a Gibson Les Paul guitar and a drum machine. Julian later recalled this time as one of the few periods when their relationship felt natural. But even this reconnection had limits. By early 1975, John returned to New York and reunited with Yoko Ono. That same year, on October 9, 1975, his second son, Sean Lennon, was born. John then entered a self-imposed 5-year hiatus from music, focusing on raising Sean. He referred to himself during this time as house husband, emphasizing his role as a present father. For Julian, now entering adolescence, this shift was impossible to ignore. The father who had been largely absent during his early years, well, he was now publicly committed to full-time parenting. But with a different child, in a different phase of life. Sudden loss and the aftermath. By 1980, John Lennon returned to music with the album Double Fantasy, released on November 17th. The record marked a public re-emergence after half a decade of silence, featuring themes of domestic life and renewal. Around this time, there were indications that John was attempting to reconnect more broadly with family members, including Julian. Communication existed, and there were signs of a willingness to rebuild, but the process remained incomplete, still in motion rather than resolved. Then, on December 8, 1980, everything fell apart. John Lennon was killed outside the Dakota Building in New York City by Mark David Chapman, a 25-year-old from Hawaii. Earlier that same evening, Lennon had signed a copy of Double Fantasy for Chapman, who waited outside the building for hours before firing 5 shots at close range as Lennon returned home around 10:50 p.m. 4 bullets struck him, and he was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital. Chapman did not attempt to flee. He remained at the scene, reading The Catcher in the Rye, a novel he later said he identified with deeply. In subsequent statements and court records, Chapman cited a mix of motives, including a desire for notoriety, resentment toward Lennon's fame and perceived hypocrisy, and personal psychological instability. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in 1981 and was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, where he has remained repeatedly denied parole. In the immediate aftermath, attention turned not only to mourning, but to the estate. At the time of his death, John's wealth was estimated at around $200 to $220 million, built from Beatles royalties, publishing rights, and solo work. The legal foundation of that wealth was a will signed in 1975, the same year his second son, Sean, was born. That document left the bulk of his estate to Yoko Ono, with provisions structured through a trust benefiting her and Sean. Crucially, there was no direct, clearly defined inheritance allocated to Julian Lennon in the same way, setting the stage for what followed. In legal terms, the situation was not unusual for a will written at a specific moment in time, but in human terms, it created a fault line. Julian was 17 when his father died, still a minor under UK law, and his financial position was tied largely to earlier divorce arrangements between John and Cynthia Lennon. Those arrangements had included a trust fund and support payments, but nothing on the scale of the estate now under Yoko Ono's control. As the years passed, the disparity became more visible. John Lennon's music continued to generate substantial income through royalties, licensing, and reissues. By the mid-1980s, the Beatles' catalog alone was producing tens of millions of dollars annually. Albums were re-released, songs were licensed for films and commercials, and new formats, such as cassettes and CDs, expanded the revenue stream. Yoko Ono, as the primary controller of John's estate, oversaw these assets, making decisions that shaped how the music was used and distributed. Meanwhile, Julian began his own career, releasing Velotte in 1984, which sold over 1 million copies and earned a Grammy nomination. Despite his independent success, the contrast between his position and the scale of his father's estate remained a persistent backdrop. In the late 1980s, Julian initiated legal action against the estate, seeking a more equitable share. There were no televised hearings or detailed disclosures, but the fact that the case was ongoing was well known. The dispute lasted for years, stretching into the early 1990s, and was ultimately resolved through a confidential settlement. Reports at the time suggested a figure in the range of $20 million, though no official number was confirmed due to the private nature of the agreement. What was documented, however, was the duration and intensity of the process. Legal disputes involving estates of this scale often involve complex negotiations over intellectual property, future royalties, and control rather than just a one-time payment. In this case, the settlement effectively closed the legal gap between Julian and the estate, providing him with financial security that had previously been uncertain. But the lack of transparency meant that the exact terms remained undisclosed. But now, finally, Julian could move on. Identity, resentment, and gradual reconciliation. In 1984, at age 21, Julian Lennon released his debut album Velotte, recorded in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and produced by Phil Ramone. The album performed strongly, reaching number 17 on the Billboard 200 and earning platinum certification in the United States with over 1 million copies sold. Its singles, Velotte and Too Late for Goodbyes, both entered the Billboard Hot 100, with the latter peaking at number 5. Within a year, Julian was nominated for the Grammy Award for Best New Artist, marking a commercially successful and critically recognized debut. However, his success was immediately accompanied by persistent comparisons to his father, John Lennon. Critics frequently noted similarities in voice, tone, and songwriting style, often describing his vocals as strikingly close to John's. As a result, Julian's work was rarely evaluated independently. Instead, it was consistently measured against an established musical legacy. This pattern continued as he released subsequent albums. The Secret Value of Daydreaming reached number 32 on the Billboard 200, and its single Stick Around became a number 1 hit on the U.S. Album Rock Tracks chart in 1987. His 1991 album Help Yourself, featuring the environmentally themed track Saltwater, further demonstrated steady output and moderate commercial success, though comparisons to his father remained a defining aspect of his public reception. Then there was his relationship with Yoko Ono. Reports frequently portrayed tension. In several interviews during the 1990s, particularly around the time of his legal dispute over John Lennon's estate, Julian said he felt left out and not considered in decisions that affected his father's legacy. He also described the situation as unfair, especially in relation to how the estate had initially been structured. At other points, he spoke more broadly about the family dynamic, describing it as complicated and difficult. Yoko Ono, in his view, was indeed part of that complexity. As the 1990s progressed, Julian expanded his creative pursuits beyond music. He moved into photography, publishing works such as Timeless in 2010, and became involved in environmental and humanitarian efforts. While he continued releasing music, including Photograph Smile and later Jude, these ventures allowed him to establish a broader identity less directly tied to constant comparison. In later interviews, Julian spoke openly about his emotional journey. By 2009, he described carrying anger as a constant cloud, emphasizing that forgiveness was a gradual and ongoing process rather than a single resolution. Over time, his perspective reflected a more balanced understanding of his past, acknowledging both personal pain and the complexities of his father's life. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.